Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this Hordes Dairyman monthly webinar. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hordes Dairyman magazine. I will serve as the host for today's webinar, which focuses on heat detection in dairy cattle. We'll be talking about automated activity monitors, intensity of estrus, and reproductive programs that incorporate both activity and timed AI. If you are listening to the presentation live, you have the ability to download a copy of the slides that will be used in today's presentation. You can find that in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. There's a handout section, you can click there, and there is a PDF where you can click on that link and then download those slides. Also want to let everyone know that if you have any questions for our presenter, please type those into the questions section of the control panel, and we will address those following the presentation. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Ronaldo Cerri as our webinar presenter. Dr. Cerri is a professor of animal reproduction at the University of British Columbia. He's also the director of the UBC Dairy Education and Research Center. He earned a veterinary degree from Sao Paulo State University and then followed that up with further education at the University of California, Davis and the University of Florida. His current research at the University of British Columbia focuses on developing solutions to fertility issues in dairy cattle and beef cattle. Dr. Cerri, welcome to the webinar, and I look forward to hearing your presentation, which is titled, Using Technology to Understand Fertility in Dairy Cows.
Thank you, Abby, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for sticking with us today. So I really appreciate the invitation, and in today's webinar, we'll be talking about basically activity monitors and estrus detection, how this can be, somewhat incorporated into your reproductive program. So I'm going to be talking about a variety of things. So I hope all that can be useful. An introduction here just to acknowledge a bunch of my students and some of my major collaborators during this past several years in which I was able to produce much of the data that I'm going to show you today. And as an outline of the presentation, we'll be talking about a bit of the context of this, technologies on estrus detection, some data on validations, some of the issues that used to be problems, obviously, in the past, but no longer today. A bit of the alerts and intensity of estrus programs here. I'll be talking first about how these can be incorporated, or estrus and these activity monitors incorporated into a reproductive program, and later about some of the data we have on the actual data that comes from these activity monitors that are not normally used, but we've been doing quite a few research on that and can be readily used, for those that have this tool. And last but not least, of course, these interventions on certain things that can interfere with the data or some of the alerts. How can we use estrus, for example, prior to the voluntary rating period to make decisions? A few things that we did about, using GNRH at AI for these cows that come in estrus, and lately here, a few things that we are working on as far as genetic selection, on how we use this data from activity monitors, particularly estrus, and incorporate that into genomic selection in the future. The precision dairy farming, obviously this is not a new thing. In the past 10, well, maybe 5 to 10 years, this has been grown tremendously here in North America. Obviously Canada and the United States trailing behind a little bit, especially Europe, which was more used to use, especially Northern Europe. So all these pedometers, accelerometers, video analysis, I think is something that is being worked on. Some other players are doing good advancements here, but not as much as pedometers and accelerometers, of course. So the measurements of rumination, line time, eating time, tracking position, and so on, all of them are now available. Many of you are obviously very familiar with this data, things that can use not only for estrus, but obviously for health information. These are the wearables that we have today. Obviously, much more sensoring technologies are around, also for temperature, humidity, and for feeding data and so on. So to begin with, the hardware and software One thing that is sort of we forget about sometimes about the use of this hardware software is that before the use of them was more limited, mostly because of sensor breaking, lost data caused here for sensor malfunction or communication failures. Wi-Fi was not as developed as it is today, battery issues. If you go and look at lots of the startups that wants to break out, into the market, they do have, or sometimes the most difficult thing for them to get into the market is this. It's not even that they don't have good ideas and so on, but the hardware and software have to be extremely reliable, particularly in a farming setting. I normally talk that everything that is technology-wise, sensor-wise in farm has to be more or less military grade, because they have to withstand a pretty harsh environment, animals that bump into them, and they are pretty harsh on electronics. And this used to be quite a bit of an issue. Thankfully, especially for the big players today, especially on the estrus detection side, all these companies, I can tell you that they produce pretty good hardware and software. They are very reliable. They tend to not break as much as they used to. So this is the first thing. The second thing is the reliability of the alert. We'll talk about the next couple of slides about the validation of them, a little bit about specificity, sensitivities of them, how good they are. But the integration side, this is something for the future. Okay, so this is something that lots of these different companies with different softwares, not only on the parlor, but for example, DairyComp and sensor wearables, not always they talk with each other as well as they should, but this is something for the future. So as the first slide here, I'll talk about something that we did in our very small study that has recently been accepted, just to validate what they do. And it sounds like an easy thing, just like, do they measure what they say it measures? So in this case, it's a pedometer, it's a leg-mounted pedometer. And what we found is that this correlation here, so this 0.74 or 74, roughly out of the total steps that an animal makes, about 88%, it is measured correctly. So it's not necessarily the correct way to read this, but I think it gives you a good sense that pedometers, they measure really well what they say it will, okay? The only thing is that there is a few differences between walking steps and stationary steps, but that doesn't come now to say. It's just saying that, it measures quite well. The second thing would be to measure what would be the efficacy of them. So this is just data that was, kindly to me, by Dr. José Santos out of Florida. And this is just a really simple thing. We have similar results in our own farm, but what it says here is that your specificity and in this case, your positive predictive value here tends to be really high. This has to do, or it says the following. It basically measures, everything that it catches. It normally is estrus. Okay, so it's very good at measuring estrus. The only thing is that the sensitivity, which means the ability there to capture all the positives, not always are perfect, which basically means there are some false negatives around. So or false positives around. So basically, you have cows that might be don't show estrus, but they ovulate or they regress the cell. Sometimes this is, or most of the time, this is not the fault of the system itself. It's just that the cow, not every cow reads the book. Not every cow comes in heat with those changes in behavior as the way it should. So basically, in this question here, and this is a study done by the group in Germany, can we use sensors to detect, for example, resumption of cyclicity? And the idea for this study initially was to say, oh, can we use this data? And we were going to show some data about some of these early detections and how affects fertility, how can you use it, for other things. And it says here that basically you have a pretty good specificity, but a very bad sensitivity. So it's not very effective detecting cyclic cows. It's very good at detecting anovular cows. So basically, for this first estrus, the system, and that's the reason why is that, normally your first estrus can be, or not always, but it can be silent. But at the end of the day, is just a matter of trying to use this data as best as you can. Not always you can use the sensors as to develop very good like physiological studies, but in practice, you can use somehow. Although this is not perfect, you're going to see later that you can use some of this data to define, for example, some cows that could go straight to time of the eye programs, for example. These are some of the validations. So at the end of the day, the message here for validation is that the hardware and software in current estrus detection systems, automated estrus detection systems, are pretty good. They have very good hardware, software. They tend to be very good with very good specificity in general, very good positive predictive values, which means they tend to, the ones that are positive really are positive, but they are not perfect. They are not going to be 100% not detecting there. It would be silly to say that. So the second part of this outline, we're going to talk about alerts and intensity of estrus. So first of all here, something very practical about reproductive programs, and then the associations this with fertility, particularly regarding intensity of estrus. So this is a very simple study, very complicated to do, but very simple in design. We did a pre-sync followed by an off-sync, and the idea here is that during this interval, 12 days between the last PG and the first generation of off-sync, we bred by activity, and the other one, we just let all the cows go to time of the eye. And this was done quite a few years ago, but was among the time where many studies had been done about using the activity monitors within a reproductive program, particularly for first AI. What we saw was that in this case here, we have a bunch of what we call survival curves. So all the animals here starts, open, and many of you are used to these types of graph, but the more they fall here means that they becoming pregnant. The faster it falls, it would mean that the faster they become pregnant. So if you see big difference between the two lines here between activity treatment and time of the eye treatment, that would mean that you would have a difference. What we decided to do was that this activity here was the treatment, and then here was just the ones that followed the animals or followed the treatment as it was intended to. So there was no differences. Here are the time of the eye or the pregnancy per eye between the estrus and time of the eye programs, and you see that in this case there was not much of a difference. Where we saw more or less of a difference was that when you have anovular cows, the difference between anovular and cyclic cows, you would have quite a bit of those that are anovular cows, they suffer way more in the activity cows. So both reproductive programs have similar pregnancy eye, but anovular and health issues are more detrimental to estrus-based programs. In this second study here, what we did have was that the AI following, we did a second study, in this case was done by a group out of Ontario and Guelph. And what they did was they enrolled cows here in a double off-sync program. So the group out of Stephen LeBlanc in Guelph. And the other one, we tried to follow cows quite a bit here, to be detecting estrus, and then followed by an off-sync for the remaining cows. So this was a more aggressive kind of way in which we look at these programs. And what we found was that basically there was no difference here between the cows and this is, pregnancy per AI by 88 days of milk. One thing that I want to say, by 88 days in milk, all these cows here were bred only once. Although, and in this case, activity monitors, what we did have was like a great proportion of cows, or a large proportion of cows, also were bred twice. So at the end of the day, what we had is that no difference, although there was a numerical difference here. And even if you see our animals that, for example, if you go out here for a double off-sync program, about 50%, or which is very common to observe in many farms, what would you say? What would you see is that there's not many difference between the two, particularly in this study. What I'm going to show here at the end of the day is that studies here out of, and those are relatively older studies now, but all the way from, from Jeff Stevenson in Kansas, Paul Freak in Wisconsin, again LeBlanc in Ontario, Jeff Buell at the time in Kentucky, and Julio Giordano, which has done quite a few studies, using activity monitors and much more. And in this case, all of them, they look at a different, every now and then, different voluntary waiting periods, sync protocols, obviously pregnancy AI, first AI, because you have differences here in days in milk, or pregnancy AI at 200 days in milk, different days open. So all of this, in certain ways, have been looked at. Some of these things can be looked again. They're not different. Sometimes we're not comparing apples to apples, but in all of these studies, there was no significant differences in pregnancy rates between the programs that have been emphasized, estrus detection versus, time AI, purely time AI. So just as a little illustration, this is a picture when I was president of the DCRC, the Dairy Cattle Repro Council. In collaboration with Hordes Dairy, we always implement those reproductive awards. And in this case here, we have a number of them that have like tremendous pregnancy rates, all above 30% pregnancy rates, easily above 30% pregnancy rates. And many of those, we have a 100% double off-sync with first time DI, but we also have some that, try to go into estrus detection on first DI, and they also have very, very good results. I normally give quite a bit of talks about, some of these numbers. And one thing I can say, sometimes it's not very easy to compare them, but what I can say is that, one of the things that they all have in common is that great personnel, much more than, specific time AI programs or other technologies. They're all very good farms overall. So the take-home message here, the combination of estrus-based AI and time AI is still the best approach. I think I must say here that is also a little bit biased from what we show in the data. We never try to show 100% estrus, for example, or not using time AI at all. And the big reason for that is that I don't believe that is possible. Time AI programs, I think there is a big, not concerns, but there's some pushes, to have less intervention with the cows, but it is still a super tool and cannot be, you cannot cease to use time AI programs. Performance and economics have been shown to validate the fact that combination is the best approach, and further studies on identification of these selective populations are still underway, but it seems that this would be the way to go. So on the context here, so we're going to go into associations here with fertility, and in this case, so what we saw here, and this is less promoted, is this association between what you can see from, or what you can have from these activity monitors and stuff. So if you see here, these are some of the common graphs that you see around, for activity monitors. And what you'd see is that every time you have this bump in activity, normally that means that the cow is in estrus, it's in heat, so all of this. So one of the things that we actually started to measure was, how big the bump was and how long this estrus was. So this bump is an estrus event. So if it is higher, does that mean anything? If it is longer, does that mean anything? So what we saw, and this is a study we did back then, and it was one of the early studies we did, looking at this peak activity, or this percentage relative increase in activity at the time of estrus. And what we saw was that the cows that actually, and I'm going to show here a low intensity or weak estrus, they did have a much lower pregnancy per AI. You can see here that some of these numbers are pretty low. You're hovering here on the high side about 35–40%. But I'm going to try to show different studies, all these different studies that show they have sometimes lower pregnancy per AI depending on the farm, very high pregnancy AI, so they tend to be very spread. If we split this in the middle, you would see this difference, and just pay attention to this difference. So this is about a 10 to 12 percentage unit difference between the low intensity estrus and the high intensity estrus. So what is the good part of these studies that we did, from our laboratory, is that we actually made sure that all of these estrus are actually true estrus. So we were not worried at this time about the specificity and sensitivity of the alerts. We're just trying to see if the alerts that were there, they were true estrus, and that this difference in behavior meant something. Basically here, this study here out of Stephen Borchardt, Germany, and he observed the same thing. The previous one was with a different, as you can see, is a different sensor. This one here has a different way in which they measures or this intensity, but it's sometimes this measurements here, and this is something that we can talk during the discussion or questions. We're trying as best as we can, to differentiate and to have a measurement of intensity. But just to, so you know here, you do have this bump or this difference in pregnancy per AI if your activity or intensity were low compared to a high activity of estrus. This was a study out of Brazil, a different sensor again, and the peak activity here, as you go from low, all of them again, through estrus events, to high, you will see that you do have a bump in pregnancy per AI. And surprisingly enough, in all of these studies, all of these differences here between the low and high all hover around 10 to 12 percentage units, which is quite a bit, very, very, very much so. And in this case here for pregnancy AI, in this study in Brazil, those are cows that actually came in heat after they were induced to ovulate with estradiol cypionate. So it's a different condition. It's not a spontaneous estrus event, but they come in estrus anyway. You still observe this kind of differences. These differences, all the time that we analyze, we put parity, body conditions for milk production, all the usual suspects that we know that affect pregnancy per AI into the model. Another data here in pregnancy losses, we saw that, and here study is a very good study from Augusto Madureira, which is now in Guelph. When he did this study, what he observed is that, as actually you increase your relative increase in activity, you also decrease your pregnancy losses. So you increase your pregnancy per AI, you decrease your pregnancy losses, and that tends to be, or have been now over a dozen studies that we've done. We always observe this. We always observe this increase in pregnancy per AI when the cows show a more intense estrus. Now, on a different way in which we can look at this high and low intensity of estrus, we saw, and this was an observational study out of Brazil as well. So we had this Holstein heifers between 10 and 14 months of age. And what we saw was that when these cows expressed high intensity of estrus, we had a greater proportion of viable embryos coming out of those donor cows. On the flip side, when we actually have the recipient cows, and we have cows that, in this case here, showed high intensity of estrus, and then 7 days later were inovulated by an embryo, we also had a pretty high difference in pregnancy per AI in those cows. And that led us to do actually, so all these are observational studies. So we end up doing a randomized trial to see how that happened. Obviously, we had different theories, which I will explain later, but what we saw was that the differences between these heifers that were super ovulated, we had a bunch of things that we did, but the cows, expression of estrus and embryo, there was no effect on embryo stage or embryo quality, but we did end up collecting more embryos from the cows. Forget about this high progesterone, low progesterone, those are treatments that we impose to the animals. But in any case, if the duration of estrus or the maximum intensity of estrus increased, we ended up having more number of recovered embryos regardless. So the improvement in estrus or intensity of estrus actually increased the number of embryos that we collected out of these animals. So the take-home message here is that indeed very important for fertility. Not all estruses are equal. Intensity and duration have a direct association of pregnancy per AI. The different thing here, or the new thing here that we can do with the use now of these activity monitors, is that now we can collect this data. It's not yet, for the most part, very well or very easy to get all the information that is possible. But for those of you that have the intensity, or you do have this information, it is something that comes with little cost or zero cost. And there's this nice association here also with pregnancy per embryo transfer and pregnancy loss. So we saw very nice things about the validation, pretty concluding or pretty good studies showing that, you know, the blend of in estrus or activity monitors and time of the eye can be very, very good and economically and in performance. There's very interesting associations with fertility, both affecting AI and embryo transfer programs. And now we go to some interventions. Some of them, particularly this couple here, has to do with if you do have more data around, can you direct certain animals to a different program? And one, I think, is pretty simple. It has to do with health. So this is cows, for example, that heat detection and intensity in cows diagnosed with endometritis. What we saw was that 74% of animals with endometritis did not display estrus by 30 days in milk. And this is very different than the cows that are healthy. You can see here the relative increase in activity are also smaller for the cows that had endometritis compared to the healthy cows, which basically means it's very likely to affect animals that have indeed being estrus. You know, when they were diagnosed in estrus, probably their fertility will be lower. Foot and leg problems reduce heat detection via these automated monitors, both in gait scores, but also Hawk scores. In both cases, you can understand, you know, and in the first study that I showed, you know, that, you know, nobler cows and cows with hoof health problems would have lower or be affected more by the programs with estrus detection, and that is true. They will show less estrus, basically meaning farms that are a little worse regarding health management. There is a reason why time of the AI programs can be very, very good, because they, in some ways, you're not going to solve, in bad farms, you're not going to solve conception rates for the most part when you use time of the AI programs, but you submit all cows to be time of the AI, to be AI. So, and this is the case that's not going to happen with estrus detection program. So this is one with health data. So it's pretty simple. Estrus prior to AI. So I showed you in the validations that, you know, not all, or it would be somewhat harder, you know, to have this association here. Not always the monitors will catch cows to come in heat in for the very first time. But let's say, you know, by 40 days in milk, some of these animals might be coming more than once. And this is the case. What you do have is that the cows that do not show any signs of estrus by 30, in this case, 40 days in milk, they have smaller pregnancy period than cows that show at least twice by then. Okay, so what you do see is that pregnancy period was dropped by almost 10 percentage units, and you do have a much lower, almost like 24 days of median days to get to 50% of the animals or days open. So in this case, what you do have is, can you use something before? This is hardly, not always used by farms, but if by 40 days in milk, or by the time you release the animals from voluntary weaning period, maybe if you catch the information of which cows had shown estrus in the system and how many times, maybe some of these animals along with health data, you can, instead of waiting for the cows to come in heat, which sometimes they will not, or they'll take longer to come in heat, you can submit them to another or a timely AI program for example. So this pregnancy per AI at first AI, according to Estrous, this is data from Canada, and we saw something similar. Cows that show estrus by 30 days in milk, in this case, have much greater pregnancy per AI than the cows that did not show estrus. So a data out of Germany, a data out of Canada, and we do have another anecdotal data from farms that I analyzed, and that's normally true. So you do have populations that, although in this case, you can try to use better this data and have them in going to different programs, for example, or going to something slightly different for these cows than what you do have. Generated AI. I didn't explain much, so this sounds a little bit random in this case, but what I'm going to show here is that animals basically that have this low intensity of estrus, I showed you before that these animals tend to have lower pregnancy per AI, greater pregnancy loss, also greater or lower ability, for example, on the donor cows to generate viable embryos, and also recipient cows, they tend to have lower, they do have lower pregnancy per embryo transfer. A portion of the reason why that happens, and we try to study a bunch of things, we have a bunch of theories that are more physiological, but in this specific webinar, I wanted to go very much more practical. But what we saw was that these animals, they have a much greater ovulation failure. So normally, if you get data from the literature, some data, for example, from Paul Freaky out of Wisconsin, he will show pretty clearly, Jeff Stevenson has done that out of Kansas, that normally cows that come in heat, they have about 5% of them, a little more, a little less, but about 5% of them do not, they show estrus, but they do not ovulate. Okay, so just is a biological failure there. The majority of this failure we found it is in these cows that do not show estrus, very intense estrus. In this case, at this point, I did not know if that was a cause and effect, but it was an association. We did these cows that we induced to come in estrus by estradiol-cypionate, and we saw that the cows in the low intensity of estrus, they also had low ovulation rates. I'm sorry, the other one was ovulation failure, in this case, ovulation success, but you see the difference here between the low and the high. Out of the results of some of these studies, particularly some of the ones done by another former PhD student, Tracy Burnett, who is also in Guelph now, the GnRH would help cows with low estrus expression, but would not impact those with high estrus expression. Why GnRH at AI? Because we saw that they failed to ovulate. Maybe GnRH could help in the ovulation rate of these cows. And why at the time of AI? If that was not physiologically the best time to do it, it is just because it was easier. Simple as that. It was easier. So we did these groups based on expression of estrus and based on GnRH with or without. So we end up with these 4 groups here. So we did expect these high estrus expression groups not to be affected by GnRH, and on the lowest expression groups, GnRH to help somehow. We know that high versus low, we would have that difference. In general, we would use to have this difference of 10 to 12 percentage units. So if you look at this, you will see that we found pretty much that. So the cows that are in the high versus low group with no GnRH, one was 40%, the other one was 28%. And what we saw, basically those 12 percentage units that we saw all along. In the cows, once we gave GnRH to this high group, we had this small bump, was not statistically significant, but we saw a big bump into these animals with low estrus expression. We didn't expect to be that much, but it was pretty high. And that was something that, out of many farms that we did this study, many of them started to use actually generate at the time of AI for some of the estrus detection cows. Obviously, you would still need to know which ones are low and high, which again are not exactly determined really easily there at the farm. But if you want to rip out the most benefits, that would be the group that would have the best benefits. In this case, having some bump here, even if numerically it doesn't hurt, but we were trying to see which groups would benefit the most. So the take-home message here is that the addition of GnRH at AI in cows detecting estrus seemed to significantly increase pregnancy for AI, more so in estrus episodes of low intensity. These automated records of postpartum estrus episodes could be used for management decisions. So if you can or could implement or increase or implement the use of the data of estrus events before voluntary weighing period into your decision making, or at least to improve the way in which you do your first AI, that would be, and addition of generating cows can help as well. This use of sensor data to select recipient cows can also be a practical tool to improve pregnancy to embryo transfer or other value-added technologies. Get the data also from sex semen, which can also be another value-added technology that could benefit from some of this simple information that can give you a bump in pregnancy for AI. And last but not least, here is the Resilient Dairy Genome Project, which I'm part of. And the reason why I placed this slide here is because we're trying to explain or try to have factors that explain how high this high intensity of estrus is associated with increased fertility. And basically, we have a bunch of things that we studied, and obviously you already know about ovulation. There is quite a bit into progesterone, and I'm going to speed up this part just so we can go into the genetic selection side of it. But one of the things that I can tell you is that the old theory behind animals that can, for example, have greater progesterone and that lacks into dairy cows, and that leads to a bunch of subfertility, traits. That tends to be true and tends to affect also estrus expression. This is just a study that we did, a basic study that we did talking about the cows that came in estrus versus cows that didn't come in estrus. And when we collect their conceptus at day 19 of gestation, we saw that the conceptus on cows that came in estrus were much longer than cows that did not show estrus. And this is basically how this is the conceptus or the day 19 look like. It really looks like a tapeworm. And you see that all the cows in the high intensity, they have a much better profile of progesterone, during all the way from the day of estrus, which are very low. This is the basis, for example, for having very low progesterone on double prostaglandin shots, for example, but this is what you have when you have a high intensity estrus, and that follows on, so on and so forth. So intensity of estrus by treatment. And basically what you do have is that after showing that, we have some physiological parameters associated with it, and we decided to collect in a little more detail these phenotypes. So if you do collect first estrus event, for example, days in milk and intensity, and then relative increase in duration out of the following, so the repeatability of them, the combination, all of this is information that you can collect out of these activity monitors, something that would be more difficult to collect in many ways from a visual detection, or almost impossible, especially in large scale, and basically standardize this, validate. So it's a big project here. But at the end of the day, what we would like to do is to use this data to actually send or compile in a certain way, classify the cows, and that be used as a way to phenotype cows for reproduction in a way that is different, of course, than what we do today, which is mostly based on intercavity interval, days open, and so on. So as an example here, this is a study that has just been actually accepted. So the resumption of cyclicity and daughter pregnancy rates, we see here in all first, second, and third lactation, as your proportion of estrus in early postpartum increases, so is your daughter pregnancy rate predictions. So this association basically means that, you know, there's something together there. There's something that we can use even to improve your daughter pregnancy rate. But I think it is also pretty clear to show that, you know, all of this data has to be collected carefully. You see here that, you know, once an animal has ketosis, that relationship basically disappears. That is somewhat expected. All these studies that have been done in the past showing, you know, the differences or the relationship between health and reproduction will show that, you know, health will have a significant impact. So all this data that we collect for reproduction should be very well collected without the interference of health. So the health, or the take-home message here, is that the use of sensor data for genetic selection is promising, something that is being worked on right now. Potential for this complex and low heritability traits such as repro health, thermotolerance, all this sensor data or sensor information can be extremely helpful in order to improve that. And improvements over current reproduction phenotypes is likely if we can harness this information in a methodical way. I think that would be the ideal situation. It's not easy. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it's definitely possible. And biological significance of the data collected. Again, even with all these traits that I showed in terms of, for example, estrus and intensity of estrus and so on, that is, if you want to make pretty good data biologically, it has to be done with not as a data dump, but more careful. And with that, I would like to acknowledge a number of agencies and companies that helped me through this past several years and to produce many of the data that you saw today. And thank you very much for joining, you know, today's seminar.
Thank you very much for that presentation and sharing different research projects that have been done, explaining some of the differences between reproductive programs and the technology and synchronization programs that are out there. So thank you for that. If anyone would like to view this webinar again or share it with somebody else, it will be available on our website later this week. And just a reminder that all of our webinars are archived. They're available at our hordes.com webpage. There's a webinar tab and all the past webinars are there. So feel free to check that out. And again, this one will be available later in the week. We hope that you'll make plans to join us for a future webinar. If you want to move ahead one slide, Dr. Cerri. It's hard to believe, but 2024 is just around the corner. So our next webinar will take place on Monday, January 8th at noon Central Time. That webinar will focus on the dairy situation and outlook for the year ahead. And our presenter will be Dr. Leonard Polzin from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the sponsor for that webinar will be QLF. In February, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Terry Olivet from the University of Wisconsin School of Veterinary Medicine, and she'll be talking about respiratory disease in dairy calves. So hopefully you will find those topics interesting and you'll join us for a future webinar. Now we have a lot of questions here, Dr. Cerri. So I am just going to start sending them your way, and we will see how many we get through. So we will try to get through as many as we can, audience members, but just want to let you know that we have quite a few here. So first question is, what are your thoughts about a G7G synchronization program? You know, and I don't know how in depth you want to go into some of these, Dr. Cerri, but if you have any comments.
If it is too far from the main topic, I can address them all. I'll try to address them all, and I'll go with it. So I'm not quite sure in what context the question was made as far as the G7G program. I think all of these pre-synchronization programs, being the G7, G6G, or the double love sync, or the prostaglandin pre-sync, like the traditional, or used to be traditional, double prostaglandin 14 days apart, followed by 12 days interval, and an off sync 12 days later. All of them are excellent programs. I think, especially for first AI, they tend to improve pregnancy for AI very significantly, and they become extremely popular. I think today, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but the double off sync program tends to be the most popular, and also that has given quite a bit of good results, especially for first time AI, as a first time AI program.
Very good, thank you. Next question. Could we use estrus intensity as a deciding factor as to whether or not to breed a cow? For example, if a cow was sick after calving, which potentially reduced her fertility, and then she shows a low intensity estrus, should we avoid breeding her, or how do we decide if we should use synchronization in those cases?
That's an excellent question, Abby. So what I've been saying, or have seen in the field is people are starting to be a bit more aware of all this information that comes from not only the sensors, but even the information that people collect. It's very common to have a lot of information around, particularly now with other technologies being robotic milking and so on. It's very common for us to just go there, sit, and see a lot of information and not necessarily use that much. Sometimes we have lots of information on milk tests, for example, and don't do anything. But what I would say is now there is more information regarding what you can do to select populations, especially for first time AI programs or for first AI programs, in order to optimize everything. In some farms that I know, cows that have had problems during the transition, and for example did not show estrus by certain days in milk, they go straight to a timed AI program, even if the farm has a very strong estrus detection program. So if it is based most on estrus detection, if the cow fall into that situation, they go into a timed AI program regardless, because they know the animal will have maybe a 10-15% units decrease in pregnancy per AI at that first AI. So they prefer to go and put her on, for example, a double OPSI, which tends to improve, pregnancy per AI, because it has lots of other advantages on top of just synchronizing the animal really well. Now, if you do find the animal and you haven't done anything, I would still probably inseminate her. Maybe you can use GnRH at the time of AI, just as such, because worse than not having something out of this animal is having zero. Sometimes you'll have, instead of 44% conception rates out of the first AI, you may have 30 something. It's not ideal, but it's something. But I think, the ideal situation is that you use that information as a plan. So you plan to have these animals not reaching that point.
Any comments on the relationship between nutrition and reproduction, and some examples they listed here, oocyte quality, conception rate, pregnancy loss? Any comments on the connection between repro and nutrition?
Well, this is probably an answer for another webinar. The relationship between nutrition and reproduction is very clear and is very broad. So I'm not quite sure. I think it's very hard to answer this question in a more specific way. If you look at the typical stuff in terms of energy balance, protein balance, and so on, they will have obviously very important effects on every stage of the reproductive cycle, over uterus, embryo maintenance, losses, and so on. So if you have, for example, deficits in energy or surpluses in protein, for example, those are typical, very well described in the literature as having detrimental effects. Then you can go into the nutrition that is more specific to reproduction. So what would be effects of microminerals, fatty acids, antioxidants in general? So all of them, so vitamin E, selenium have been studied quite a bit, fatty acids, saturated ones, but particularly the unsaturated ones, those more linolenic acid and fish oils, for example, they all have shown some effect on reproduction. It's a very broad question, Abby.
Absolutely. So maybe a topic for a future year.
Oh, yeah.
What is your recommendation for artificial insemination during periods of hot weather, when cows are under heat stress?
This is the case for many of the cows in the southern US, southwest, or Brazil, for example. One thing that is very clear, and this is a very good question because I didn't address here in this webinar, but heat stress will affect estrus detection for sure, and it does affect embryo survival a big time. So in general, what I tend to do, or what we probably most of the people try to do, is that during hot weather or during heat stress periods, the reliance on time of the eye is more. So you do rely more on time of the eye programs because you don't depend on cows showing estrus. You will know that these animals will have still lower fertility compared to obviously not so warm weather, but it is better to submit those cows anyway. Greater reliance on time of the eye programs, I think that would be a first one. The second one would be, and perhaps this is not, I think it depends a lot on the economics involved, but in places like Brazil, for example, they tend to use a lot embryo transfer because you skip those first few days after fertilization where the embryo is most susceptible to the heat stress, and you tend to have slightly greater pregnancy per eye out of the embryo transfer. So not embryo transfer, not only for genetic purposes, but more as a therapeutic way to overcome a little bit of but again, I think in that situation, let's be clear, it's not applicable to everyone for economic reasons. And the third one, I think it has to do with just abatement, heat abatement. So it's not specifically on reproduction, but farms that do not have particularly the mix of producing movement of air with fans, but also wetting the cows with sprinklers and misters. So all of them will help tremendously, decrease the body temperature of the cow, and that will increase, for sure, will increase fertility. But those are big changes that can be done during hot weather.
Right, thank you. What is a good herd benchmark or KPI for the percent of cows that show estrus before the voluntary waiting period is over?
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, like the 2 or 3 studies that we showed, sometimes we use the showing estrus by 30 days of milk, sometimes showing estrus by 40 days of milk, sometimes showing estrus by 60 days of milk, which is normally like voluntary waiting period for a bunch of farms. Especially by 30, 40 days of milk, the majority of cows should have showed estrus. So you're always going to have about maybe 15, 20, 25% of the animals will be an ovular by the time of voluntary waiting period is done. So you will have a certain proportion. I think that depends also on the profile of your farm. Now we're seeing, every now and then you start seeing like older herds, so herds with a greater proportion, for example, of third lactation or more. And those herds are different than herds that have, for example, 50% of the animals as first lactating cows. The benchmark will vary, will definitely be different. But I would say if you use your 45, 50 days of milk, for sure, let's say 80% of your animals should be showing heat by then.
If a cow that is on timed AI does not show any heat at all, would you recommend giving her a shot of GnRH at the time of breeding?
That's a good question. Because the one thing that has happened, and I know this is obviously geared towards North America. In Brazil, we're still able to use, for example, ECP, estradiol cypionate, to induce ovulation. And in here, there's a big discussion about, it's very different. If the animal does not show heat, their pregnancy per AI is pretty low, and they, depending on where you go, they tend to do different things. But in our types of synchronization programs, for example, on a off-sync or double or pre-sync followed by off-sync, not very many cows show estrus. So it depends. But let's say 20% of the animals will show estrus, if that. I am not sure. So giving GnRH to 80% of the animals would be, I don't think it would be a good thing, or I don't think it would be a practical thing to do. If that will in that smaller proportion of cow, or this big proportion of cows that didn't show ester would be much greater than the other one. I honestly don't. I wouldn't try now. I think this is a pretty good idea for a study, but I don't think so, because in this situation, especially for, let's say, an animal that goes through a double off-sync, you change so much, you synchronize the animal so well at the same time that you normally produce a very good profile of progesterone during the growth of that follicle, during the prior to time of the eye, that I don't know if that would be advantageous. I don't know if that would be beneficial. So although I went to Mars and back, Abby, to answer this question, probably right now I say I wouldn't give it to these animals.
Appreciate the effort. There's a few questions revolving around the idea that there's sinking or decreasing public acceptance of some of the synchronization programs, and in countries like Europe they may not be able to use them at all. What are your thoughts on using activity only, or what are possible ways to get a high pregnancy rate without using synchronization protocols?
Very good, Abby. This is the answer after this that I start receiving, nasty emails, depending on what I say. What I have is the following. I think there will be pressures regarding the use of hormones, but I'm not quite sure how that would be. A lot of people, they try to make, comparisons between what happened to, for example, BST and what would happen to hormones, time of the eye hormones. One thing that I can say, time of the eye programs are safe. They are not, they have been tested for so many years now, and I don't think there is anything that would be prejudicial to, for example, human health or so on. Is it ideal to give injections to animals in order to make them pregnant? Of course, but I think that is an unfair question. I think it is what you can try to do is to minimize based on the whole complex of things. There's a certain complexity to, for example, is it ideal to give an animal that many shots in first the eye if you follow, for example, a double off-sync program? Do you think that is ideal? No, I don't think that is ideal, but it's much less ideal to leave the animal not pregnant for too long, and all of a sudden this animal will not calve, or be discarded from the herd, or will be calving in the next lactation with a non-ideal condition, more likely to become sick, and that is a much worse scenario. So I think we have to work with this kind of information and not to be, I don't think we'll ever reach the point where we cannot use it all, because even in cases where you have a heavy reliance on estrus detection, you will always have a significant proportion of animals going to this time of the eye programs. So I think the combination would be very much, I think you can explain well to the public and everybody else when you have this mix. So you try to go into estrus detection, but you also have a reliance on time of the eye programs once it's needed. I think it is more, or will become more difficult, Abby, to explain when you have blanket treatments. I think this is something that has somewhat people that work with mammary gland health and to these, mastitis treatment for dry cows. The idea of relying less on antibiotic treatment for all animals, although this is not as easy to implement as many people think it is, but it is the idea of decrease in interventions. I don't think there's anything wrong as decrease in interventions, and I think everybody would agree this is a good thing. The only thing is that we have to do it carefully, in a way that sometimes we try to implement those things, but the dairy as a whole becomes worse, and then you have problems that you were not expecting that will arise from that. One more thing before I let this question go is all of these will also depend. I think I answered this with a North American point of view, but the idea of interventions or fertility hormones use or other antibiotics and so on, it will also depend on where you are in the planet. Not all countries have the same context that we have in North America. Some other places, they are much less concerned about this for a variety of reasons, societal reasons, socioeconomic reasons. If you go to Europe, I think you're very correct. I think they're in a different stage. They would like to go into a different way. And that's fine. It's up to them to decide. But overall, I would still think there is a space for them to be used. But perhaps there will be more space for when you have a story to tell where you can minimize interventions and still keep performance going.
Thank you for that insight. Just a couple more here. Any recommendations about moving baselines for cows that are grazing? This person says they see big variations in intensity and duration of estrus, depending on the grazing season.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. A lot of the data that I showed, it probably would not fit grazing systems. I think all the data that I collect was from freestall barns, and they have a quite specific set of thresholds. I can tell you right away. The cow in freestall barns will walk 2,000 steps per day. They will lie down so many hours a day, and so on. That is pretty well. It's pretty consistent actually. In grazing, that will change quite a bit. All this intensity of estrus will not be as much as it is. Basically because during grazing, in grazing systems, the cow as a baseline walks a lot more. Okay, so your relative increase in estrus during estrus will be smaller. They will be intense, of course, they will show that intense, but that intensities will have to change quite a bit. During grazing seasons, probably it will be even more different. So I'm not quite sure what's the specifics of some of these farms if they supplement during the non-grazing season, and that's probably the case. If they go into a more confined space compared to a grazing season in certain times of the year, those activities will change night and day for sure. You would have to change thresholds for sure.
Can you share a definition for an abortion, and how long after insemination a cow, you would consider a cow to have aborted, or what is the criteria there?
And this is regards to in the studies that I showed, the abortion rate or the pregnancy losses were between 30 and 60 days. Okay, so that was the definition. But the definitions today are changing quite a bit. So today, for example, we are starting to be more, and there was a reason why that was not the case in the past, because it just takes longer to collect all the data. But it's very clear that we need to start defining pregnancy loss. First of all, you can define pregnancy loss or embryonic losses in different stages. You can have early embryonic losses, you have late embryonic losses, fetal losses, and so on. Depending on the stage, 30 to 60, 60 to something or before, fertilization to 28 days in milk, 28 to 30 to 60. That can all be kind of categorized. But one of the things that is happening probably now more than is particularly in certain places are these losses between, for example, 120 days and term. When you add all the losses, they started to pile up to be quite a bit. In all the studies from now on, probably definitions of pregnancy loss going all the way to calving or to delivery of a live calf will be probably more in the scope of some of these studies. But that's how these pregnancy losses are defined. Most of you're going to see in studies are between 30 and 60 days, sometimes between 60 and 120. And now starting to go 120 to term. And sometimes you can have pregnancy losses being defined by markers early on by 25, 26, 28 days, all the way to pregnancy diagnosis at 30, 35. So you would consider early embryonic losses, late embryonic losses, all the way to 45, 50, and then fetal losses beyond that.
All right, Dr. Cerri, if you can move the slide ahead. And
yes,
we will wrap up the Q&A. Thank you all so much for sending in your questions. I think we got to most of them, and I'm sure if there's anything that is still lingering out there, you might be able to get a hold of Dr. Cerri at a future time and ask that question. But once again, I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Ronaldo Cerri from the University of British Columbia, for sharing his insight and knowledge today, and for also sharing different research that is available on this topic. So thank you so much. I also want to thank our listeners out there for making time to tune in to today's show. We wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we look forward to meeting with you again in 2024. Again, this webinar and all of our past webinars are available on our website, and we'll have a full schedule of monthly webinars coming up in the year ahead. Until next time, goodbye from all of us here at our team at Hoard Dairyman, and take care.